Welcome to another episode of Screenwriting Uncut. As I was looking over the first 4 episodes of this series, I realized that there's not a lot of screenwriting in the Uncut. So I thought I'd create a video very specifically about screenwriting technique. And I thought, what better place to start than with dialogue, one of those areas that writers tend to have a lot of challenge with. Now, obviously, I haven't read your script specifically, so please don't be offended by the title of this video. The truth, though, is that the vast majority of screenplays that get submitted have weak dialogue at best and just atrocious dialogue, typically. So I wanted to address maybe 3 reasons why your dialogue might suck and give you some tips and tricks and ideas for how to go about changing that. I think let's start with what dialogue is. When I would do screenwriting workshops, I'd ask people, what is dialogue? Invariably, the first answer would be conversation. And the fact of the matter is, dialogue is not conversation. Dialogue is not what I'm doing right now with you. Dialogue is not what you overhear at a cafe. Dialogue is when a character speaks in the story, which means that dialogue is a function of character, which is a function of story. So the dialogue must literally reveal character or drive the story forward, interact with the other scene dynamics in some way to create an entertaining bit of information, a scene that moves the story forward. So one of the great problems that writers bring upon themselves is what I would say reason number 1, which is that you're writing your dialogue too soon. When you're imagining a scene, when you're imagining characters, it's very easy for these to become realistic in your mind. And as soon as you commit a line of dialogue to the page, you can hear that line of dialogue in your imagination. The more you read it, the more real that line of dialogue becomes. And you can get stuck with that one line of dialogue. I've seen writers change entire scenes, change entire characters, change entire stories just to keep one really cool line of dialogue. And ultimately, dialogue, that's inverting the priorities of what's important here. Dialogue is the easiest thing in the world to change. In fact, when a writer or when an actor and a director are on set and they're playing out the scene in real physical space, that your line of dialogue may feel inauthentic to them in that moment. And if it does, they're going to create a new line of dialogue right there, right then and there on set. Sometimes even improvising something, just whatever spontaneously comes out of their mouth, because it doesn't feel real in that moment. It may feel real in your head when you're creating the story, but in the moment of production, it doesn't feel real. So they'll change that line of dialogue. So dialogue, you need to be flexible with dialogue. You need to be willing to change it if it no longer serves the reality of the scene, the reality of the story, the authenticity of the moment within the story that it's happening. If you write your dialogue too soon, it becomes very hard to change it. So during the story development phase, I recommend don't even touch dialogue during the story development phase. Figure out your stories, figure out your characters, build that whole writing plan, and then blast it onto the page. That'll be the first time. If you've developed your story and developed your characters, the dialogue that comes out when you blast it onto the page will be more authentic. And then in the rewrite phase, the strengthen phase in fast screenplay, during the rewrite phase is when you refine and improve and put that little fine point on the dialogue itself. And then that way you will have the compelling dialogue that serves the story itself. So, reason number 2 why your dialogue might suck is that it's all about you. I've found very often you'll have screenplays get submitted and you can block out the character names, you can jumble around the dialogue, and suddenly you have no idea who's talking. All the characters sound the same. And more to the point, all the characters sound like the writer. The problem, obviously, is that you haven't differentiated characters. In order for us to engage with a story, in order for us to buy into a fictional scenario and care about the characters and go along that journey with those people, they have to seem authentic. They have to seem consistent. If you write a line of dialogue for a PhD character and the line of dialogue is very slangy, very inarticulate, then it's not going to feel authentic with that character. Similarly, if you have a character was raised on the streets, but they speak in these elaborate, complex, really intellectual sentences, it's not going to gel. It's not going to vibe. So what happens is the characters don't seem real to us, which means that the things they do in the story don't seem real to us, which means that we can't buy into the story itself, which detaches us, which basically makes us, as an audience, uninterested in that story. So the solution to this is to very deliberately give each character its own distinct manner of speech. Just as you're going to build different characters and know their backstories and design characters that serve your story, the speech patterns themselves need to be distinct and original, so that if you did block out those character names, you would still be able to identify the characters by how they talk and what they say. So the third reason I would say that your dialogue kind of sucks is that it was never spoken out loud. You know, the funny thing happens when we write that goes from our head through our electrical nervous system, through our arms and our fingers, through the keys, and onto the screen. So lines of dialogue, quite literally the spoken word, never actually gets spoken. So what very often will happen when you're reading a script, you're going to see a line of dialogue that you know no one has ever uttered this out loud. If you have a line of dialogue that's a tongue twister, then it should not be a line of dialogue, because most people can't speak tongue twisters. Unless it's a very specific character attribute that you're putting into your story, generally speaking, you want to make sure that your lines of dialogue sound like spoken words. So my suggestion to you is going to be, rather than, before you ever write any line of dialogue, before it goes from here through the fingers and onto the page, make sure that you speak it out loud. Every line of dialogue, before you write it, don't write it, speak it. Hear how it comes out. Does it sound authentic? Does it sound like spoken word? If it does, you can write it down. Now, ultimately, as you develop the craft itself and you have a rewrite process that really refines and puts a point on your dialogue, you'll be able to gradually get an ear for it and develop the ability to write the written word without having to speak it out loud, because you'll intuitively understand the rhythm and flow of that. But until that point, until people have told you your dialogue is extraordinary, until that point happens, I would say speak it out loud before you ever commit it to the page. In Fast Screenplay, we've got 3 detailed steps that cover like 60 different techniques for making dialogue really super effective. So the whole point is, it doesn't matter what first comes out. That first dialogue that you write can be very expository. It can be very on the nose. It can tell the story rather than reveal the story. But before you ever send it anywhere, you're going to want to refine that so that every line of dialogue is sharp and punchy and reveals character and pushes your story forward. So go forth and write extraordinary dialogue. I hope this has been helpful and inspiring to you. Thank you for joining me, and we will see you next time on Screenwriting Uncut. Thanks.